Yeah, if you could, but don't worry too much if it's still going.
Yeah. Okay. I have your PowerPoint on my.
Oh, is that okay? Thanks, Ben. So,
do you mind if I stand? Is that okay?
yeah, where we go.
All right. Great. By the way, I'm Ben. Great to meet you. I'm going to scoot this chair. Scoot this over a little bit since we're both going to be using a PowerPoint. So Ben, I see you're all set up. Did you want to go first? Yeah, that's easier. And I have his PowerPoint on my computer as well. So
Are you going to be over here?
Or where do you want to stand? Yeah, I can be right here.
Okay, I just want to make sure the people at home can see what's going on. Okay. Yeah.
Can I get both the screens? There you go. Right.
Yep, like this whole side of the room is perfect to you.
Okay. Are we maybe start? Maybe you'll give it another minute just because people might be knowing that. Yeah, sure. Are we live already?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Do we want to begin?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Right.
Okay, welcome everybody to a panel on DFW's short fiction, Rights and Logic. Glad to have you with us. I am not Grace Chipperfield. As you may have determined, I'm Daniel Leonard, and she covered for me yesterday, so I appreciate getting to be here with you all. We are starting today with Ben Zimmerman, our independent scholar from Newark Academy. Senior at Newark Academy High School in Livingston, New Jersey, studied philosophy in secondary school programs at Harvard and Columbia. His essay and argument in favor of operative truths won PLATO's 2017 to 2018 National Essay Contest and was published in the fall 2018 issue of PLATO's journal Questions. He'll be telling us about quantificational logic in good old Neon. Let's take it away, Ben.
Thank you very much. All right, so first of all, thank you very much for coming, and I just wanted to really quickly thank some people without whom this presentation wouldn't have been possible. So just the names up there, I really appreciated their help at one point or another. So what I'm basically trying to talk about is, and it's not going to be super mathy, or it's not supposed to be alienating in any way from the Wallace audience. I came to Oblivion and to good old Neon in particular not having any real background in formal logic, but really wanting to understand a statement that gets made in the story that I'll get to in a little bit. So it comes from a place of wanting to kind of spread the philosophically interesting aspects and allusions of Wallace's work to a more generalized audience and making logic and the more mathematical stuff more accessible and easy to interpret for literary analysis. So let's get into it. So just a quick refresher on Good Old Neon. So Good Old Neon is a story from the Oblivion collection, comes out in the early 2000s, and it's written about the same time as Everything and More, his math book. So the story is about Neal, and Neal, it's first-person narration, and Neal is talking about how his entire life he's been a fraud, and there are a number of different things that he's done to try to stop. They range from cocaine to therapy to vigorous exercise, but nothing really seems to be working, and so most of the story is a meditation on his attempts to become less of a fraud by going to analysis with a man named Dr. G. So let's see where the problem arises with this story. So, as Hegel said in the introduction to his difference essays, philosophy becomes a need in times when the simple and beautiful harmony of existence is sundered by the awareness of basic dichotomies and antinomies, when the believers become alienated from the gods, man from nature, and the individual from his community. So, what happens is that Neal, as he interacts with Dr. G, is told, well, this actually takes place after both of them are dead, and they're having a conversation in a sort of afterlife liminal state. And Dr. G puts forth this proposal that there are really only two kinds of people, and I'll get into the paragraph that it comes in with the logical symbolization in a minute. But essentially this is important, and important to the case of Neal and Wallace in general, because it's got this very fatalistic undertone of in the context of the story, Neal is a person who will never be able to change. He will never be able to become less of a fraud no matter what he tries. And throughout the story, he's been trying a lot of things and becoming increasingly despairing about their lack of success. So real quick, just reading the important part. Dr. G has a theory that there are only two orientations a person could have to the world, loving or fearing, and that you can't do both, and you can't do neither, and you can't switch between. So basically, you're either a happy person or a sad person, and for people like Neal and depressives like Wallace himself and a number of his other characters, life isn't going to be great, which is sad and not something that most of us would want to accept for obvious reasons. So let's break down what's actually being said here. So symbolic logic, in this case first order logic, is a sort of a created mathematical language that allows you to symbolize statements in English and other natural languages, as they're called, to better evaluate their internal grammatical structures and their truth values and what's really being said amidst all of the prepositions and qualifying statements. And so just to break it down quickly, I'm going to translate all of the little symbols bit by bit, and there will be a highlighted correspondence here. So for all individuals X, Wallace did hate the word individuals, called it a noxious puff word, but in logic you actually have to use it because it's not specified what type of individuals they are, so it's kind of a term of art. But so for all individuals X, if X fears, then X does not love, and if X loves, then X does not fear. Additionally, it is not true that there is an individual X who neither fears nor loves. It's pretty much just a very complicated and long way of saying what Dr. G summed up before and what we were able to clarify in pretty basic English. But the real problem here, and we'll come back to the symbolized aspect of it in a minute, is that like a similar issue arises that to the one that Wallace found in Richard Taylor's Fatalism when he was a senior at Amherst College and writing his philosophy thesis on it. So this comes from the Introduction to Fate, Time, and Language in Jamie Ryerson's great essay. And it says, Richard Taylor's fatalism can be seen in this light as a forlorn picture of people frozen in time, beholden to a future they are powerless to affect, cut off from their own agency. And I think that this is really the case in a microcosmic sense with Dr. G's statement, is that essentially it says you're either one person or you're the other, and you can't change and you have no power over how positively you view the world and how happy of a person you are in your life. Which is not a picture that's particularly consonant with Wallace's more philosophical themes and motifs in his work about redemption and the possibility of change, like with Don Gately and the Enid House narrative of Infinite Jest. So let's also think about the fact that this statement is being symbolized in a different mathematical language. And especially if you think about that Wallace's main objection at the end of his response to Taylor was that a metaphysical conclusion was being foisted upon a group of people using a semantic argument. And he thinks that those two things don't really work together. If you want to make a metaphysical claim, you have to use metaphysics, not semantics, as he famously says. And this is particularly interesting because in Everything and More, which is written about the same time, there's also a character named Dr. G, Dr. Goris, who's a fictitious calculus teacher that Wallace supposedly had in high school, although it's not actually the case. But even in Everything and More, it is said that Dr. G acknowledged the problem of putting a statement in natural language into like a more mathematical representation. So this also fits in with Wallace's larger theme of kind of being a little wary and hesitant about the way that language gets treated and the way that things kind of get reductively put into language. And particularly, you see this with his Empty Plenum essay, which comes after David Markson's novel, Wittgenstein's Mistress, and in Fate, Time, and Language, and as a theme which Mr. Dendolk discussed earlier in his keynote speech. But so, going back to the logical statement, let's evaluate what it's all leading to. I mean, what's the significance here? Why should we care? And what I'm arguing is that we should care because it's a pretty fatalistic depiction of the world, literally, And Wallace was someone who, like Hegel described at the beginning, believed in the need of philosophy and the use of philosophy as something that rescues the individual from isolation within themselves, and the belief that you're powerless over your relation to the world and your fate. So if we consider the outcome, I was reading some of the interviews in Conversations with David Foster Wallace, and I came upon this really interesting little quote where they're talking about everything and more. And Wallace says, he's talking about the uniqueness part, and Caleb Crane says, I didn't really understand that part of the book. And Wallace says, in a nutshell, the idea is if you can show that all the different series that a function expands to are equivalent, then it is just one series. So I took that idea, and with some novelty and liberality, I applied it to the logical statement. So you can really split it up into 3 parts, or 3 different little series. It's not what a series is in math, but there's a little bit of wiggle room here. So now that I separated them out, I saw if they all converged on one kind of more simplistic or atomic formula or axiom. And in fact, they do. So I used a long logical proof that splits into different parts. The primes or little single quotation marks denote different parts, but basically if you have all of the pieces of this statement, and I'll get back to why that's important in a minute, you can really bring it all down to one formula, which says for all individuals, either that individual fears or loves, but there's a little important logical gap, because it technically says for all of those individuals, they either fear or they love or they do both. He hasn't kind of obviated the possibility of doing both or doing one at one time, and like, for example, fearing earlier in your life and then learning how to love. So even though he purports to accurately represent these two mutually exclusive things, there's actually a little logical gap. There's a little piece of redemption there. And you might say, well, that's just happenstance. I mean, it looks like you had to do a lot of questionable stuff to arrive at that conclusion. But I actually looked at the Ransom Center archives, and I think that there's grounds for deciding that this is a somewhat significant revelation. So if you look at earlier drafts of the story, and you don't have to be able to read what's on screen, its handwriting is, I had to buy a little magnifying glass with a light just to be able to read it. But so these are, and if you look at the next slide too, there's some different drafts of good old Neon over the course of which the notation changes. So for example, just if you look here, you can see how he uses the word or in there as well. In the previous version, if you're familiar or conversant with the language, it's pretty meaningfully different, even just the way that he notates certain connectives. So if you take the original way that the statement was written, which is given up there, notational changes accounted for, you can, through a similar process, reduce it down to this little formula, which essentially says, for all individuals, either that individual doesn't fear, or they do not love, or they do absolutely neither, so they're completely apathetic. And why I think that this is somewhat meaningful in terms of alternatives is that, on the one hand, if you look here, you get Dr. G's as it appears in the print copy of Oblivion. All of the possibilities for individuals are expressed as affirmatives. Instead of not loving, you're fearing. Instead of not fearing, you're loving. So even in instances where the modality is kind of less positive, it's still expressed in a way where you have agency. It's not a negation of something else. It's its own positive concept, as Hegel talked about in his faith and knowledge. But so importantly, most importantly, is that with the new symbolization that appears in print, you get this possibility of an individual both fearing and loving, like most of us do, where we, have some good feelings about the world and some bad feelings about the world, which is totally okay and permissible. But with the other argument, that is not a logical gap. Instead, you just get apathy, which is not really much of an improvement from fatalism with one option or the other. And there are a number of other ways that you could work out of the logical claims that Dr. G and Neal make throughout good old Neon. And I've enumerated a few of them here, and I'm happy to talk about them later. But to harp on logic or formal systems or philosophy, even in such an abstruse and abstract sense, as something that rescues you from this problem, is to miss the point a little bit. So, as is said in one great review of Fate, Time, and Language, The fact that we cannot pin down exactly why a paradox is a paradox does not mean that that paradox is important. Wittgenstein's response to Richard Taylor's argument that we do not have a free will because statements about the future are either true or false today would be a primal one. You are playing with words. And that's exactly what's happening in the case of Dr. G's argument. Sorry. So there's no reason why, just because the argument is symbolized, it has to hold true. In fact, one of the possibilities of refuting it is that, for an argument to actually have calories, as Wallace would say about the world, it has to obtain, as Bertrand Russell would say, it has to be true of individuals. And so this is where something really interesting comes in. Because as an individual now, you have the opportunity to decide whether or not this equation will be true of you. Famous philosopher Quine said that to be is to be the value of a variable like x in the equation. So you can say, if you plug yourself into the equation, taking, again, some liberty with how formal logic works, you can prove that you are a person who both fears and loves the world, or fears and loves at a different time. It really restores the agency back to the individual. And again, with what Wallace said about Taylor, there's a recognition that you must kind of refute people on their own grounds to do your philosophical duty and your scholarly duty of charitability, but you also have to transcend that a little bit. And now we can kind of get to the more humanistic and transcendent meaning that comes out of the story and its message in the commentary on logic and language. So one super important quote that really resonated with me from the story is when Neal is talking about his experience with suicide and saying why you don't have to go through it, and he says, but it wouldn't have made you a fraud to change your mind about going through a suicide. It would be sad to do it because you think you somehow have to. And that's very much the case with fearing and loving. You shouldn't think that you are a person whose disposition towards the world is set and unchangeable. Just because you're having difficulty with a certain mindset now doesn't mean that that's going to be the case forever. It's a pretty poignant and important commentary on mental illness and worldview, which is a problem for many of Wallace's characters and was for Wallace himself, and especially as one for Neal, who takes his own life because he believes that no one's going to change that he's a bad person. And with the paradox of the logical statement about who you can or cannot be, I found a really interesting epigraph to one of Wallace's math books that he had annotated in the Ransom Center, which was a quote from Hamlet, which Hamlet says to Ophelia, "This was sometime a paradox, but now time gives it proof." So, applied again to the statement, you can start out fearing and think that you're only going to be on that track, and then end up loving and give proof that the paradox has a slightly different meaning. And what I really am trying to draw attention to here is that even though, sure, this is just a statement in a symbolized language, maybe it was put in the story just because Wallace wanted to show off a little bit, maybe it was just supposed to add some texture, but I think that there's a certain importance to considering the philosophical concerns and implications of Wallace's characters and the problems they face, especially since so many people engage in readings of his texts that verge on anagogical and that spiritual value and philosophical values really extracted, and people really develop and part of their lives can be affected by Wallace's work. I know that that's the case for me, and with most any author that you read that thoroughly and has that much of an affinity group surrounding their followership. So, just in conclusion, I think it's really important that we consider in the midst of all of these pessimistic and fatalistic and sad stories that there often can be little glimpses of redemption and little logical gaps written in that are important not to forget and really kind of hopeful to find. For me, finding that little gap was pretty meaningful, even if it only seems like an academic novelty. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you appreciate that message.
So much, Ben. If you have a burning question, please write it down or hold it in your mind's eye just so we can make sure we get time for both presentations. So we'll move now to Matthew. You want to stand over there?
I've got a calf muscle tear, so it's easy for me to sit.
Well, we can accommodate that. And so Matthew Alexander is a PhD candidate at the University of Liverpool. His research interests are based around gender and gender relations in the works of Wallace, and his personal ethics with respect to animal rights activism intersect to widen his approach to Wallace's corpus, resulting in the paper we're about to hear from, titled Verbalizing Violence, a hashtag #MeToo and Animal Rights reading of David Foster Wallace.
Okay. Right, thank you. So, in terms of this, some of the images in this are graphic, but in terms of the paper itself, I'll be getting to brief interview 20, but there is nothing graphic about that. I mean, we're all kind of familiar with that story, but I don't go into the actual kind of violence of that in any great detail. So as I said, there are one or two disturbing images that are mostly kind of animal related, as opposed to the kind of the sexual violence that will kind of spring from this discussion. Now, as far as the Me Too aspect of this, I find that a very useful cultural moment in exposing everyday ways that sexual violence informs society and demonstrates a normalising effect of violence, and the ways in which behaviour can then be modified by certain sections of society as a result of this. Now, the example I'm going to point to in this to start with is the opening chapter of Broom of the System, where we find Lenore in the room of an all-girls dormitory that is guarded with armed guards. So it's the safest of safe spaces we are we maybe kind of led to believe. And quite soon the conversation turns to this idea of how to avoid being raped, effectively. Campus rape. The prevalence of campus rape becomes a discussion amongst the girls in the dormitory room, and Lenore's sister Clarice terms this as well, it's kind of common sense. That's the way she describes it, as if this is the kind of the responsibility to avoid that situation. Now, aside from that, or following just slightly afterward, there is then the forced entry with the with the underlying sexual threat that comes from the two frat boys that enter the room. And what we have, or what I find kind of fascinating about this, is we have this, Lenore describes this 15-year-old scoping out college way before really she needs to, that she's pretty intelligent. But as the narrative moves forward away from the first chapter, we find her in an entry-level job. And one of the things that I find a kind of interesting question is, is this an example that has kind of informed that, that move or that change in her career? How does this kind of bright, gifted 15-year-old end up, in a few years' time, just in the kind of the entry-level job? Is there something about that situation that kind of informs that, which I said we can only kind of guess at? The other thing about the Me Too is obviously Wallace is now under has been now under the Me Too spotlight, and Mary Carr's tweet, which I'll kind of read from, described as its own form of starkly tragic poetry. Tried to buy a gun, kicked me, climbed up the side of my house at night, followed my son, age 5, home from school, had to change my number twice, and he still got it. Months and months it went on. And then aside from that, we can find in D.T. Max's biography that there is examples of her being ejected from a moving car and having coffee thrown in her face. So it seems that these kind of it seems like a good moment with which to discuss difficult issues in Wallace's text. The other aspect is the animal rights side of things. Now, put simply, this stems from it was my reading of the 10th anniversary edition of Carol J. Adams's The Sexual Politics of Meat, and its dedication in memory of 31.1 billion each year, 85.2 million each day, 3.5 million each hour. And there's no explanation to this, but what it effectively is, it's the amount of animals killed for consumption. And this kind of forms the basis for Adams's argument that the cultural images of sexual violence and actual sexual violence often rely on our knowledge of how animals are butchered and eaten. And Adams goes on to state that when women are victims of violence, the treatment of animals is recalled. And here, I mean, following the discussion of campus rape, but prior to the frat boys entering the room, the forced entry, Lenore recalls being told about college parties that are like being at a meat market. So again, the interest was, well, you know, what else? You know, does this kind of stack up? Does Adams's, you know, discussion here of, you know, violence, animal imagery, sexual violence in particular, does that work? One of the key things about Adam, or one of the key phrases from Adams's text is the absent referent. Now, I mean, there's a couple of examples here. The abattoir, you know, the shaded figures in the field. You know, you don't find that in an abattoir. You know, the cow and the pig and the sheep are not standing in a field in a pretty little place. The image to the other side is more of what you get. And the idea of the absent referent is this living non-human animal becomes dead non-human animal because it's killed, cut into parts, sold and plated up as beef, pork, sausage burger, etc. Not as cow, pig, baby, sheep. And then is eaten, it becomes the absent reference, sorry. Now, a couple of terms I'm playing around with at the moment. I mean, one is the feminization of animals, which thinking about the sort of dominion aspect from Genesis, you know, this idea of these kind of passive subjects that you know, that humankind is given dominion over to do with as they will. But this idea of kind of feminization of animals, the central panel, the GIF that's kind of moving there, that's one, maybe just kind of hold that image in mind for later. But we've got, you know, Lola Bunny to the left, Minerva Mink, and we've got Melissa Duck in the middle there. The other is the kind of reverse of that, the animalization of the feminine. And again, a couple of the images here. One is the Hustler's last. It was tagged as Hustler's last all-meat issue of 1978, stamped grade A fine, and a quote from Larry Flint: "We will no longer hang women up like pieces of meat." And then to the other side of that is an actual image from a end sexual violence campaign using an animal carcass in clothing. Now, the reason, the reason of kind of setting this up to start with is looking at a couple of Wallace's essays in particular. His coverage of the Maine Lobster Festival and the Illinois State Fair. So consider the lobster, which, you know, he's widely kind of praised for this, and you know what he does in this essay, and is praised for writing one of the most engaged and probing discussions of the relation between the human pleasure principle and animal suffering. And in effect, Wallace turns what kind of should be, what I imagine it, you know, was the idea of it is, you know, do a simple report for the Maine Lobster Festival, report back for Gourmet Magazine, you know, tell the readers what it's like to go and, you know, attend this thing. But he turns it into a prolonged consideration of the ethics of boiling a sentient creature alive just for our gustatory pleasure. One example of this will be his discussion of lobsters having the claws pegged and banded when they put into the tank, which has to be done or they will rip each other apart because they're not meant to be in you know, such close quarters. Then there's a footnote on from this that details the processes of debeaking broiler chickens and brood hens. Same thing, you put them in, you know, close quarters and they will peck each other to death, but you can't have that if you want to raise them and sell them and exploit them. Dehorning cattle, cropping swine's tails, similar kind of thing. You know, the pigs will chew off each other's tails, the cattle will skewer each other with the horns unless you do this to them. Yet in spite of what Wilson Kaiser describes as about this essay as an ethics of affinity on display, following the assignment, according to D.T. Max, as you know, taking Karen Green's recollections, Wallace goes on to eat several lobsters in one sitting, which I kind of find that slightly bizarre. But anyway, the next essay is the ticket to the fair, or getting away from already being pretty much away from it all, the Illinois State Fair. So around a decade earlier, in an assignment for Harper's Magazine, Wallace reports on the events at the Illinois State Fair, spending a considerable amount of time again discussing animal rights issues, but you know, potentially not what people were expecting from the essay. And Wallace and his travelling partner, Native Companion, find themselves appalled at witnessing acts of animal cruelty. And a couple of examples of this: a cow's legs keep half buckling. This is while the cow is being scrubbed for exhibition, and the owner kicks at them, the legs, we're told. And as the cow almost tips the steel frame over at one point, the owner punches the cow in the ribs. In a further example, sow is kicked by a handler, and Wallace interjects, "I had bacon yesterday. I'm standing here wringing my hands over a distressed swine, and then I'm going to go pound down a corn dog." And then the realisation from Wallace that, not that it's profound, but I'm struck, amid the pig's screams and wheezes, by the fact that these agricultural pros do not see their stock as pets or friends. They're just in the agribusiness of weight and meat. Now, a little further on in the text, the language starts to focus on the way in which Native Companion is objectified by the carnival ride operators, according to Wallace, and a sexual innuendo and the perceived threat of sexual violence start to figure. So too does the use of animal imagery and allusions to carnivorous practices. So that's the link with the Adams text. And we get Wallace telling us that they tend to look at Native Companion like she's food, which she ignores. They're ogling her nethers, obviously, and as she's being spun, you know, she gets offered the free ride in the cage as she's being spun by the carnival operator. It's kind of told that, well, they're trying to spin her to look up a dress. There's a distended, high-pitched scream from the whirling cage, as if Native Companions getting slow roasted. So again, this kind of allusion to kind of animal imagery and carnivorous practices. There are also other non-explicit, a few non-explicit examples that I would say are kind of easily passed over. One is the Whataburger sponsorship from Infinite Jest. This huge kind of corporate, fast food thing that is partly responsible for the 31.1 billion dead animals, animals killed per year, the 3.5 million per hour. There's also violence in John Billy, the sheep being exploded by dynamite for no apparent reason. And then again, a really kind of subtle thing: the cow in the field by a fence in Little Expressless Animals at the beginning. Well, when you stop to think, well, what's the cow doing in the field? It's waiting to be killed. It's waiting to be eaten. That's its only purpose in life, according to what we do. Now, when we get onto the explicit examples, and for this I've chosen brief interview 20, and the Granola Crunches experience, and this is this is why the image from slide 3, we get the Granola Cruncher, who is described at one point as looking like a really sexy duck. So Melissa Duck, I assume, is what a really sexy duck is supposed to look like. So that's why the GIF was up there. And the Granola Cruncher's fate, obviously, as we kind of heard Allard's keynote before, is that she survives being brutally accosted and held captive and very nearly killed. The person responsible for the abduction and rape of the Granola Cruncher, with the threat of murder, is this sexual psychopath, capable of inflicting unimaginable brutality on a human being because he does not see them as human beings, but merely as objects of his own needs and intentions. So this kind of talking in terms of human, valuable, and non-human, disposable, I find is kind of key here in this discussion. And throughout the text, throughout this particular sort of passage with the psychopath, the Granola Crunch is not only dehumanized, but is akin to an animal being hunted for slaughter and subsequent consumption. And there's a couple of, trust is mentioned. So that's that's what you would do to an animal to stop it from kind of kicking. You would tie it. The gambrel, where you would, hook it by its legs and hang it up and bleed it as part of the process. The use of the hunting knife or the machete or the bolo talk of you know of being a predator, and the and as Allard mentioned earlier as well, this kind of the interviewee of the story sauntering carnivorously over to the Granola Cruncher to initiate, obviously, what he you know what he sees is going to ultimately lead to sex. The reader also learns that a certain percentage of psychotics, we're told, slice the victim's Achilles tendons to hollow them. So effectively, caught, bound and immobilised like a non-human animal prior to being butchered, the Granola Cruncher moves from subject to object. And Adams's thoughts on sexual violence and associated imagery would appear to be consistent with the Granola Cruncher's experiences. There is again one tiny moment that we can kind of factor in from the Pale King, Tony Ware's experience of, you know, she's been chased, you know, she's in the car with her mother, they're being chased by her mother's violent ex-partner, the car overturns, and as she's lying there and the mother's, she's not dead, but the blood is pooling in Tony Ware's throat, and the only way, you know, she can avoid the attention of this guy who is going to kill her mother in front of her is to do the trick she learnt as a child, and it's to kind of hold this kind of stare, but it's described as this dead eye fish stare. So again, you know, looking at how this kind of animal kind of link is worked in there. Now, Adams's text calls on feminist theorists to consider the reality behind the metaphor where animal oppression relates to women's experience. And in the case of the Granola Cruncher, it's undeniable that the experience of the non-human animal, and specifically its position as disposable objects of consumption, the absent referent, is the master metaphor at work. The question is, do we continue to ignore the implications of such language simply because of eating habits? And as the cultural locus continues increasingly to be influenced by the rise of the Me Too movement and by veganism respectively, it seems fitting to ask these uncomfortable questions. And that seems to be a good part of this conference so far, is that uncomfortable questions are being asked and there are no easy answers. But I think this is where kind of dialogue helps, is to do that, because if you don't do that, where do we end up? And this idea of disturbing the relation between human and non-human animals as well, you know, to fail to do so seems to mean that we, like Wallace, would continue to pound down on animal flesh at this rate of 3.5 million animals per hour, knowing that the violence around carnivorous practices extends into other areas of human existence, in this particular instance, namely that of sexual violence. And I think also it's a good opportunity to widen understanding of the Me Too movement and to challenge audiences for whom thoughts of modifying behaviour is not their utmost concern. And that, for me, would be, with Lang and Biff, the guys, the frat boys, that have no thought of what this behaviour might lead to. To them, maybe it's just a laugh, it's just a joke, but it isn't, and it needs to be called out. In terms of issues, the one thing I've kind of wanted to do with this, and from speaking with friends and colleagues, is to raise potential issues. Now, I think one of the obvious things is, a reading of Wallace in a Me Too context. I mean, potentially for some that would be inflammatory, but again, I think I've kind of set out why it's a good idea to do that, or at least useful. Another is, well, is this Me Too 2006, or is this hashtag Me Too? Which again speaks to, is there a voice that is privileged more than the other? Is there a voice that gets kind of dismissed by another group? I mean, that's a kind of potential issue in question. Another issue is that much of Wallace's writing reflects a cisgender world. I think again that seems to have kind of come out today. Is that it's not lost on me that I've discussed brief interview 20 with the Granola Cruncher, and that is this our only concept of violence towards women? Is that the only type of woman there can be? Are there other types? Are there other types of violence that isn't always directed at women? And what I would say about that is, I think brief interview 46 I find ambiguous in a really kind of interesting way, because we get this, is it his wife just a general, you know, woman figure that's kind of suffered this kind of gang rape? Is it him as a 16-year-old boy that suffered it? Or is it no one at all? Is it all completely made up? You know, again, it's kind of problematising that. But also mentioned today the Penmillis brothers' experience. The child that has the Raquel Welch mask put over the face and is sexually abused. You know, and the sister's lying in the bed trying to kind of breathe softly so that, you know, the stepsister, so that she's not, you know, taken into that as well. And that it does seem to be, there are all manner of types of kind of sexual violence in Wallace. It isn't just this kind of, you know, violence towards women that is, you know, that is there, and that this is a kind of important thing. There's also, from my discussions, there are also issues with regards to trans exclusionary and sex worker exclusionary feminism as well, which in part stems from my use of Adams. You know, if you're kind of familiar with Adams' work, she has been called out about trans exclusionary comments. She seems to have sort of defended those reasonably well. However, the sex worker exclusionary, I would suggest is probably, you know, I don't think that is defended terribly well. And I suppose the whole thing is, isn't it more productive to consider such problems than to not? So, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Opening the floor for questions for one or both of our panelists, but not neither. I don't know how to express that in first order logic.
Can you go to the slides right before the pan?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt Larry's question. Yeah,
That one?
Thank you, yeah.
I have a question for Matthew. Well, I mean, I guess it's a general question. I agree that it's really productive to ask questions and have like conversations around like animal rights and Me Too and everything. I'm just wondering, like, when this stuff with Mary Carr kind of came up to the surface again, did it challenge your relationship to his writing? And like, I guess I ask because I feel like, I don't know if it happened for a lot of people, but I kind of had to like negotiate like how I felt about his writing again. I was just wondering like where you sit with that.
Yeah, I think I mean, I suppose from the kind of the outside kind of perspective, it's like, oh, you know, what, the white middle-aged plus kind of guy is you know, what business does this guy have to speak of such things? So yeah, I think it's kind of fine-tuned that, but I think I was always kind of sensitive to the aspects of Wallace's works that I've just for so much time I've found so, you know, so disturbing, and then the fact that they haven't been, at least in my mind, explored fully. That, you know, things seem to have been kind of skirted around, and, you know, it hasn't really been discussed. So yeah, I would say it's you know, it's probably made me even more sensitive as to how I approach things than before. But surely, I mean, surely that is a good thing. I see no reason why it shouldn't be that way. Yeah.
Let's see, if I recall correctly, I think the Diazs revelations also came out about the same time. I wonder if anyone reads, is it Julian Diaz, is that how you say it?
Yeah.
I think that also was almost concurrent.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any differing reactions? I'd be interested. I hardly read Wallace, to be honest, because I have no time, but I'd be interested to see if someone had sort of different, was affected differently. I don't know.
Well, I mean, the difference is, you know, Diaz is still alive. Mm-hmm. So, like, when his thing, when the Me Too about, you know, Diaz came out, it was very, he actually seemed, his initial response seemed to actually, for lack of a better term, slightly face up to what he did and almost admit it, and then boom, the second that came out, the publicity machine turned on, and his agent and his publisher crafted this letter and put it out, and it just said, "Oh, he steadfastly denies this. This never happened. This is an awful accusation." And I found it very, very interesting that Diaz's initial kind of reaction to it was to, I mean, not entirely tell the truth, but at least to say, "Yeah, I'm pretty sure I did this," and it was in fact not him, but kind of the corporate interest behind him as an author figure that tried to turn the narrative around. And what that made me think about, because in classes all year, I mean, at the school I go to, you can't get through an English degree without reading Oscar Wilde multiple times. So we had lots of conversations about this, and one day Wallace came up, and I mean, for me the question is always, A, would this have resurfaced were he still alive? And B, had it, how would the reaction have been, I presume, from Little Brown? For me though, like the stuff about Diaz doesn't fundamentally change the way I read his literature, because his literature is full of awful, awful, predatory masculine figures. So, I don't know.
Did it change how you read Wallace?
A little bit, yes, but it wasn't, I didn't find it a huge shock in that some of the, like when Mary Karr said it herself online, it became, a lot of people started to pay attention, but these facts and these stories weren't buried. Yeah, like the thing about the gun and him contemplating murdering her ex-husband has been around for quite a while, long before she stepped up and talked about it. So for me, it didn't really change much about how I read Wallace, because I don't know, when I heard the whispers of that stuff before she talked about it, it kind of didn't surprise me, which is maybe sad.
Well, it almost speaks of a kind of defense of that position in some way, that, you know, it was known, but it's kind of suppressed.
If I recall correctly, she had a tweet thread. She screenshotted a DT Max section of his biography that he wrote, if I'm recalling correctly. I'd be interested to see what people are thinking about that. She accused him of minimizing her.
She said he downplayed what she had told him about it.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting discussion to have. I mean, what Max came out of, like, maybe
12.
There's like, I mean, there's a lot of language around it as well. I mean, I remember there's one interview with DT Max where, well, maybe it's in the, I can't remember exactly where it's from, but he makes the comment about like what it is about Mary Karr that caused such trouble for Wallace in terms of his feelings and stuff. Like, I think there is like a language around it at the time that probably did shape how it was received, and that Me Too put it in a different light.
If I recall the timeline correctly, like a lot of the crazy stuff that Wallace did was before they started dating, actually.
Yeah.
Which sort of makes, I mean, it seems like they just had a really messed up relationship. Like, obviously he did some super screwed up stuff, but then they ended up getting together for a while. Like, I think, I don't know. So
that was always
this whole thing is like, I don't know, people get into messed up relationships and do crazy stuff.
Yeah, I was always unclear about the timeline too.
I'm pretty sure that like the threatening to kill and throwing a table at her and stuff before they started dating. When they started dating, not that excuses acting like an asshole, but I don't know. I'm not involved in this. Obviously, the whole thing is terrible. But I don't know, like Diaz, if you read his work, or you read Wallace's work, and you're just like, there's some super problematic stuff about interpersonal relationships here. Like, I'm not turning to Wallace to teach me how to love my wife. I'm not turning to Diaz to teach me how to be a good man. The one thing I want to say about Diaz, didn't he come out with the essay that was like, I was abused as a kid, like like immediately after?
No, I think it was right before.
I think
it was like in the air, like it was, this is going to come out. And so, like, and I read that thing in New York, I'm like, man, this is super real and super affecting, and it definitely colored because I think you're right that it came out before it was publicly written. I was like, oh, okay.
Kind of like a weekend.
And then like immediately afterwards, it was like, oh, so now he's being accused of stuff. And it definitely prepared me in some way to be like, not to excuse it, but to be like, oh, well, but it's got stuff that happens in the odds. I don't know. I think, and that might have been a ploy by him or his PR team, but definitely affected the way that I responded to that.
Any questions for Ben on presentation?
Yeah, actually, so I loved this.
Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, I appreciated the way that you. It's been a long time since I took advanced symbolic logic, so I was like, yeah, that's kind of cool. I knew some of that. Okay, yeah. But I wondered if so you were like laser focused on one little aspect of the story, and I wondered if you had thought about that sort of. Because if I understood you correctly, you were kind of looking for a space of ambiguity that would maybe make a space for something like freedom. And I wonder if that at all affects the way that you understand the sort of thrust of the story that comes towards the very end, where he's sort of like, of course you're a fraud. How could you not be a fraud? Think of all of the stuff that's going on inside of you. How is there any way that you could possibly authentically, represent that?
Yeah.
And I wondered if there was any relationship between those.
There's honestly there was a lot of other stuff that I looked at that just for reasons of time I couldn't incorporate. But one thing that really stuck out to me.
Yeah, it wasn't a critique.
No.
Yeah.
It was a quote in the Cambridge Companion about good old Leon, talking about how it ended with a moment of kind of shared dialogical communication. And I think that there are a number of ways in which you can read the story and see that there are some redemptive messages, and including looking at the way the narrative is formed and the way there may or may not be someone in the car with Neal and the way that time's working, because it's a very involuted and kind of framed narrative. But the big thing for me was just that I saw the story as a whole emerge with a few themes about difficulty articulating, but also just feeling caught within language in one way or another. And so I thought that if I could show why you weren't really caught in this most precise and punishing or exacting of formal languages, then there were some implications and ripples that would, in a way, indirectly address the smaller or the more peripheral concerns voiced. And with more time, I would have loved to tackle those head on. But for me, this was the big kind of one stone that I wanted to go after.
It's really cool because, I mean, you rightly bring up this, philosophy thesis, right? And the sort of logical analysis that he's doing there. But then you're connecting it to, so this is when he's 23, 22, something like this, but you're connecting it with like one of the last stories, right, in the Oblivion collection, and it's furthermore, it's the preoccupation in a certain sense of the room of the system, of how language works and how we're bound by language, and can we get outside of language, and can we, escape the sort of entrapment of language. So I thought that was very, very interesting.
Yeah, I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Right, we need to close down so people have a chance to mill around and pick their next panel, but let's give our panelists a round of applause.